Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Crisosto Apache. He's the author of most recently Ghostword. Before I introduce you to Crisosto, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I am thrilled to introduce you to Crisosto Apache. They are originally from Mescalero, New Mexico, on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, and currently lives in the Denver area with their spouse. They are Mescalero Apache, Chiricahua Apache, and Diné Navajo of the Salt Clan, born for the Towering House clan. They hold an MFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and are an assistant professor of English. Crisosto's debut collection is Genesis from Lost Alphabet, and their second collection is Ghostword from Gnashing Teeth Publications. They're also the associate editor of The Offing magazine, and their profile can be seen on the Poetry Foundation's website. So, Crisosto, welcome to Poet.
Thank you, Radha, for having me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation, not only about my book, but what will come out of it. So I really appreciate you reaching out and having me part of this conversation.
Well, I think this is going to be a really unique conversation among the conversations I've had with poets coming out with books recently, because Ghostword is a collection that was really generated in a unique way. And I got to experience some of that at a local reading recently. And you talk about the genesis of this particular book in the preface. Would you mind describing that process for us?
Uh, I think this particular book, it took a very long time to conceive. And when I was first introduced to this idea, it really came out of having one of my professors when I first entered college, Arthur Z, introduced this writer to me. And at the time, I didn't realize how this writer would impact me, but I was really drawn to this carbon copy of this book, A Fool's Life, by a modernist Japanese writer by the name of Ryūnosuke Akutagawa. Uh, and I took a lot of time over the years to kind of spend some time with each of these entries. And there are 51 entries to this last manuscript of his. And not only the life of Akutagawa intrigued me, but most specifically what this last manuscript meant. Because there's a tragedy behind Akutagawa's life when he wrote this last manuscript. And he did this manuscript while he committed suicide. And I read that it took about 3 hours for him to die. And he wrote this manuscript in those 3 hours. And I think it was that sort of drew me in, which is where the title comes from. Because I carried this manuscript for a number of years, in the back of my mind, it felt like Akutagawa was kind of following me and, sort of prodding the back of my mind to kind of look at this manuscript and, sort of maybe communicate with it. So when I was in my undergrad program, well, that's not really true. I tried to do this once before, but I only tried to do it with one poem, and it was the last one, 51 Defeat. Um, and I sort of used one quote from that book to start the poem, but I think that was really the conception of when this idea started, and that was back like in 1993.
Hmm.
But then it really didn't kick in until like 2009 or 2010. I was challenged by one of my professors that because I was explaining this idea, and she basically told me, "Well, if you're going to do it, do it. Don't just talk about it." you know. So I then challenged to put myself together in a room in the sunroom and sort of gave myself 3 hours because I was already familiar with the manuscript. Gave myself 3 hours to sort of, spill my guts, basically. The first attempt was not successful, nor was the second attempt. So I realized that if I was to give myself 3 hours to write my swan song, what would it be? And it took me a much longer time to do that. So, but what came out of it was the skeletal structure of this book. And at the time that I did this, I still wasn't sure what the book was going to be about. And it wasn't later until I really spent some time rereading Akutagawa's A Fool's Life and also going through my manuscript and began to see the parallels that started coming out of that, which is really what we see in this collection. The collection is, my book is broken up into 3 parts. The first 2 parts was, the first section is the first attempt, the second section is the second attempt. There was a part of me that sort of grappled with the idea of chronologically putting these poems in order. But then after a while of going back and forth, I did it once and I undid it. I did it once and I undid it. And I just finally said, this is what, the way that this process went is how the structure of the book should go. Because it shows a different scope of how the mind works when you put something together. Because on my first attempt, I was just going through the poems and I was responding to the ones that really spoke to me. So they came in that order. And then the second attempt was to finish off what wasn't finished. And then the third part really was just kind of responding to some of Akutagawa's short stories and his collections. Because for a number of years, I tried to find actual stories of his, and I couldn't find anything because a lot of his work was out of print. It wasn't until recently that I finally came across an older book of that contained A Fool's Life in it, along with a couple of other short stories. And I started reading more of his stories, and I became more interested in his work. And I wish more people would discover Akutagawa, because his stories are really phenomenal. And the fact that he wasn't so confident in his stories, but they survived over the number of years. But really, that's how the book came together in these 3 sections. Just kind of through experimentation, and I just kind of kept that and kind of used that as the format for the book.
That's wonderful. And it's so interesting to hear about that iterative process. The sort of the basis, right, which is this Japanese writer's work that it sounds like you lived with for many years, sort of absorbing and like a kernel almost. And then, through this series of iterations, what emerged was, in fact, a whole book, not just a single response, but, something that comes through in these 3 sections. So there are some really profound themes that tie the book together. As Arthur Z points out in his blurb, it's a testament to struggle and survival, and X, the mysterious light of existence. Were you conscious of those themes and the scope of what the manuscript might become as you were writing the poems, or did you become aware of those themes, later on in the process?
When I started putting this manuscript together, I think it was awaking the psyche. It was sort of starting to dig that hole into what would then become a lot of what I focus on my work. When we look at the book and the different sections, like I said, it was broken up into 3 sections. The first section I called A Life, which is sort of dealing with this idea of sort of the discovery of Akutagawa and the work that he did, and then became that sort of light, that spark. So that's what the first section I started to focus on as far as that. And then the second section is then called A Death, which is, again, kind of a hint toward that second attempt, which, wasn't successful, but then at the end, I made it more palatable. And then finally, the third section is called A Resurrection, which is going back and rediscovering a lot of the work that he had done, and sort of awakened this part of me that made a connection to what the book was about. I think it wasn't until reading more of his work that it started to sort of jar this idea of where the book was going to go directionally. And a lot of it was really just going back and looking at some of the themes that Akutagawa had focused on, and start pulling information on those themes that I knew about, and starting making personal connections to them. And when I started writing them, I started to think in certain terms of a persona that I thought would sort of connect to a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm.
So that started to form later on in the book through the revision. Once I had the structure together, I knew that I didn't have to worry about that. Now I have to start going back and figuring out the substance of the book,
Mm-hmm.
even though I had sort of a small idea of content.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just needed to pull out more from that.
Mm-hmm. So family themes are prominent in the book, and I wonder if you might be willing to read a book from the beginning section called Shima, My Mother.
Yes. So the idea with a lot of these poems is I tried to interweave like my indigenous language within in the book, but I didn't want to be too heavy on that, because I think that I wanted to have the book accessible to a lot of people, but at the same time make a connection to this historical familial part of the book's existence. So there are moments, and because the term Shema is very close, it's not saying that it's your mother or their mother, but it's my mother, my, being individualized, being specific. And when you look at indigenous language, anything that you say she to is very personal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like saying mine or my, it's like very individualistic. Mm-hmm. So I tried to sort of pair that off with identity, Shema / my mother, and then also pairing it with the same title as Akutagawa. So this is number 2, Shema, my mother. Quote, just a brick wall, the ledge planted with fragments of broken bottle, unquote. R. Akutagawa, number 2, mother. In a sating ritual old as the polished grain on the pine vessel, my mother leading me down my little fingers down the aisle of each worn pew. On this very Sunday, toward the front of each steady row, she prefers to sit askew, just so she can hear the droll organ blurt, the dull notes of some eager redemption. So she thinks. And to hear the pathetic rotary sermon drooling from a vacant, whittling facial frame. Those eyes sift over every black shoulder. She tries to avoid the ocular slide at the differential pace from the pastor's glance and the fracturing light emanating from the colored window that coats the outer ends of the congregation. This very Sunday, fixating on a multicolor panel of stained glass, away from the stench of dried pine, preserving skin, eyes, and teeth. This very Sunday, a sick feeling took hold of me, and the vessel containing the origin of her own words, searching for the white orbs lost inside the soul, turned up onto it herself, there in the front row, a resigning swath word to a coffin, to the ears where she never bid a formal farewell. So this particular poem, I used to have a lot of conversations with my mother over the years, and every time we've concluded our conversations, she always sort of ruminated on this idea of missing her mother, because she lost her mother at a young age. And for some reason, and I'm not really sure why our conversations always ended with that, but in some ways, I think I was privileged to be in that presence of story, to be in that presence of emotion. Mm-hmm. And she would tell this story all the time about, her mother's funeral. And in some ways, this idea of disconnection or disassociation kind of happened. But it was over the years after her mother's passing that she was able to talk a lot about that. And I don't think she's ever had a moment to do that. And so me being able to have those conversations with her was kind of an honoring moment, but I think at the same time, a very interesting interaction. So that when I started thinking about that and this idea of mother, that really came up because I think this idea of loss is what I was looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, as you mentioned, the sort of the inadequacy of of language in the face of these situations, these losses, the atrocities, and so forth throughout. How do you think about, that inability of language to meet, both, that moment of loss and also, like perhaps the slipperiness of identity. How does that play out for you in what you put on the page?
I'm a very visual person. I think everything I look at is from a very visual perspective. And I think a lot of that really comes from growing up as a young individual. I started off as an artist, a painter. That's what got me into college. Halfway through my first semester, it was Arthur Z who convinced me to focus more on writing and see what can come out of that. But it was through this process of writing that began to make me think about what identity meant. And it was also the idea of being the first person in my family to graduate high school and to get a formal education, and also to possess, advanced degrees. It became more of a separation for me to acquire those I don't know, necessities. That every time I went home, I was forcefully reminded about who I was and where I had come from. That when I start to write, I have to pay attention to the idea of persona. I also have to pay attention to the idea of imagery, and then how all of that can be made into something that can be passed on to the audience through emotion. And I think I've learned that over time, that I can't just throw these images out there and hope somebody can grapple with them. But if you really take the time to nurture the writing and begin to enthrall yourself in it, there is an emotion that you can trigger and get others to feel that. And I think I've never been forced to do that. I've always played around with this notion of imagery because I'm so fascinated with words and what something looks like. I never really was forced to think about what that might make me feel like. And I think this is the first time I've really worked with that. Mm. And each time that I pick up these poems, and I think this is probably the most difficult part of it, it really takes me back to those moments because I'm really dealing with the idea of feeling and correlating that with imagery, because I'm hoping that it places people in these very specific moments that they can sort of recollect. I mean, if you ever sat in a church and you sat in pews and you look around and you see stained glass windows and you've ever heard that organ, it is these ideas. But then there's something more specific about that poem that is personal. But I mean, there are these images that anybody can grapple with and hold and look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious, it sounds to me like the images maybe come first in the writing and then you build around them. Is that true? Or talk to me a little bit about your process with the poems, the individual poems.
Yeah, I do think that imagery comes first because, like I said, I'm a very image-based person. And when I start to think about a concept, it's always the images that come first. But then I'll put them aside and I'll keep doing that because, I'm always having a work in progress. Like right now, I'm working on my third manuscript and I'm almost done with that I'm calling Isness with NESS in brackets. But anyways, yeah, it always starts out as an image-based poem. But then now that I realize that emotion is a really huge part of that, I now have to start focusing on this idea of what do these images represent, and kind of just move away from just looking in that box and pulling out maybe color. Like if I'm using a color red, why am I specifically using that color red? And how am I using that to perpetuate this emotion? I have a poem in here that I use that same concept in, and it is the poem number 34, Conquered, where because I sort of loosely base that on this idea that of using the idea of mixing color, because like I said, I was a painter, and going back to that idea of mixing color, and the more that you add a certain color, it dilutes the other color or becomes dominant. And I tried to figure out how I can take that metaphor and that imagery and sort of encapsulate the idea of emotion in it.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to read that poem?
Sure. Okay, so this one is called number 34, Conquered. Quote, that 7 or 8 years ago, he hadn't understood color. He realized now, unquote. R. Akutagawa, number 34, Color. As I permanently expect, I unscrew the caps on each paint tube. I squeeze the first paint tube, releasing a bit of white titanium color. I then open the next paint tube and squeeze the second color. I scoop a bit of scarlet red that seeps onto the unsettled palette. I render the two colors together, and in time I add a bit more titanium, white, creating an unadulterated red. Each time I mix in more white, and it dilutes the red even more. And each time I blend in more white, I lose a greater part of myself. So a lot of that has a lot to do with, my personal journey, like moving away from the reservation, and this sort of idea of becoming colonized. I think is the term that a lot of people are using now. That if I ever go back, and anytime that I ever go back to my reservation, I can sense, how urbanized I am, and how much removed I am from, the cultural identity that I grew up with, that my family grew up with, and because they still live there. And, and it's kind of sad for me to kind of look at that and deal with that. I mean, sometimes I put it on the back burner and say, you know what, I don't have to deal with that now. But I know that it's forced on me when I go back home. I see how far removed I am from the way I used to think from a cultural perspective, and now how I have to present myself in a very westernized way. And you can tell by the way I talk and the way I express myself that I've went back home. It's only evident, and it really. And I try not to talk when I'm back there. A lot of that really is based on cultural situations or etiquette. But a lot of it for me is because I don't want people to only see that part of myself, right? Because when I go home, I don't like to use the word refined, but it almost seems that way. I've sort of been living out here in the westernized world, and I've become, very educated and very aware that when I go back home, it's a very different feel. I feel like I'm just kind of entering this realm that I've been trying to bury for so long, and I'm not really sure why that is. Because I think in a lot of my conversations out here, I talk about this idea of colonization and decolonization, and even, a lot of the historicalness of things that happen in what we're calling America. And I represent that in my own experience, but out here, it's all just talk. But when I go back home, it's like I'm going back into that realm, into that, what I would call the 21st century concentration camp.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I just want to pause here to say how much I what you were describing earlier about bringing folks into the experience of the emotion around, various circumstances. I think that that's what's so profound to me in this collection is the resonance that is available to readers. So, um, yeah, I mean that, straddling those worlds, so to speak, is, yeah, you sense the speakers, the personas, in these poems, um, grappling with that, and um, I was curious if you might say a little bit about the title of the collection and what that means to you, and if that relates in some way to this idea of a lack of language, or the world, the different languages in different places, or a loss of some um, ability to translate between or speak between.
So yes, the title of the book, the idea of a spirit, is kind of, in a lot of ways, it's kind of taboo. I mean, from a cultural standpoint, from where I come from, there's a lot of taboos that I grew up with, and like I said, I'm now considered myself sort of a westernized person that I don't really believe a lot of those things anymore. Like this idea of the dead. We're not supposed to be around them, or things that deal a lot with the dead. And I have a poem in here that is about the dead. But this idea of spirit as well. I mean, like when somebody passes away, there's sort of a way that we handle ourselves so that we allow the person to transition into the next world. But again, I don't have anybody around me to practice that with me, or me practice that with them. Because a lot of people don't really believe those beliefs. So the title itself kind of, because I've been dealing with a manuscript that was old, and I don't say book because the book was published after he died posthumously. I still call it a manuscript because that's really where I think Akutagawa's spirit lies, and he hasn't finished speaking about what was contained in that collection. So for me, looking at this idea of the manuscript, even though I found like books online that are published, this to me, I just consider it a manuscript, and it's unfinished in that sense. So to me, the word ghost kind of is implied in that sense of this book. And because we're dealing with words, I just thought, this is kind of an idea. And what got me to think about this idea of word, putting ghost and word together, is a collection of a Mexican poet by the name of, let me see if I get her name right. Paul, her last name is Colome, Pura Colome Lopez, and her book, Watchword, started getting me to think about this idea of how we're representing an idea in a title. And I thought that was really a good starting point. And I started thinking about what she wrote in her collection. And I thought, well, Ghostword kind of is in that same idea and realm of connecting to Akutagawa because of how he died. And that sense of, this manuscript followed me around these numbers of years, and it does seem like kind of a spirit or a ghost that was in my presence, and I had to keep going back to that, and it sort of haunted me and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So and the title changed a lot of different times, but I think it finally settled on this concept of these words had followed me for a number of years, and I've interacted with them, and they've sort of ingrained on my spirit, my mind, my expression of creativeness, and trying to make sense of the world. But it was because of that following that got me to sort of pay attention more closely to what was available to me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
the image itself, I mean, is it's a picture I took when I went back to the reservation a number of years ago. Yes, and that image is what I called unusual specter, and it was an image that I took, and I didn't realize how significant this image would be because of where the picture was taken. I just had this idea in mind one afternoon and got one of my nephews to, sort of play along. So I just had this idea of like having this face like, you know, obscure, and that they're holding like ceremonial things in one hand and modern things in another hand. But of course, I didn't have time to really, sort of orchestrate a very perfect notion of what I wanted. But this is what really came out. I mean, I went into my mom's closet and she had like all these extension cords, and she had these plugs and game adapters and everything like that. I ended up taking a pillow from the hotel I was staying at, and it was in the car. And I ended up taking the pillowcase off of it, and we ran up the canyon from my mom's house. And I told her to take his shirt off, put the pillowcase on, and hold the extension cords and stuff in one hand. And I, quickly wrapped the longer extension cord around his, torso. And we gathered some twigs that were just kind of in the area. And I just had him, take a lot of different poses, and just kind of just stand there, and I started taking all these different pictures. And the original pictures are in color. So when I went back to the hotel room, I downloaded them and I began to look at a lot of these various different poses. And this is the one that stuck out to me. And I said, well, it's kind of an interesting image. I really kind of like it. But then I started playing around with the tone. I did it in black and white and sat with it for a while. And then I did the sepia. And it was the sepia that I was really drawn to because it reminded me of something that was old. Like back in the 1800s, they did a lot of photography in the daguerreotype with the silver plates, and you had to stand there for a long time just so you could capture the exposure. It was in this photograph kind of reminded me of that, so I kind of used it as sort of a focal point to help get that connection to the writing. And once I did that, that's really when a lot of the writing or the revisions for what the book will turn into came about. And I, like I said, I'm a very visual person. So when I started to look at that, it started to really pull out a lot of the essence of what became the book.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, and again, like I said, the significance of this picture and where it was taken is later on, I lost my little brother, and everything that surrounded that event was just tragic in its own sense. So my mother's house was up the canyon, and from there was one of the major roads called Highway 70, and it's one of the main drives that a lot of semis take to connect Roswell to El Paso to Carrizos, I mean to Las Cruces. So a lot of semis they drive through the reservation on that particular road. The tribe had the notion of building a truck stop right below my mother's house, so we could walk there, because it was that close. Well, my brother was coming to visit my mother one day, and tragically got in a car accident with one of the semis right there at the bottom of her house. Well, what ended up happening was, as part of the ritual, we had to take some of my brother's stuff and bury it beneath a tree, and do some, ceremonial things to those items. And it was in this area that I took this picture. So again, we're going back to this idea of, sort of dealing with the dead, and this idea of a ghost and spirits. And I didn't put that together until, I realized where this image was taken. So again, that's also represented in this book, in one of the poems that I call Flabaya. Is, I kind of blame my stepfather for my brother's death, which is kind of one of those things that has not really left my mind. But yeah, so the title itself, it really has a huge, deep connection because of that. It has this historical significance. It has this familial significance. It also ties back to Akutagawa's work. Um, so I'm really satisfied with the title of the book, and it took me a long time to find the appropriate title.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is such a you know evocative title in all the ways that you're describing. And that image, I think I remember you saying that you had taken that photograph, and it makes a lot of sense in what you're saying about the visual being so much a part of your process. But it's fascinating to hear, the background on these different elements that we see represented in the photo, and also knowing that that place is sort of a confluence of many experiences, um and also just deeply sorry for the loss of your brother. um there's
Uh,
so much
well,
sadness in that poem.
one
Yeah.
thing I was afraid of, and again, this is just kind of the publishing world as we know it, is that because this image was so tied to the story of what's happening in this collection, I was afraid that if I did send it out and it was accepted for publication, they're saying no, we can't use that. That's a crazy picture. You know, but I don't know if the stars were aligning, or everything was meant, or these ghosts were at work, making things happen. But my publisher came back and said, this is a very interesting picture on the cover of the manuscript. Who took this picture? I was like, well, it's one of my personal pictures that I took. They were glad, I think, because one, they had the copyright because I gave it to them. I had the copyright, but I gave them permission to use it, and they didn't have to go search for an image or have somebody design the book; that it was already there. So I think it was that was one of the biggest things that I think made the cover happen. Was because I had this picture and I had it available, and I used it as the inspiration for the book to kind of pull together a lot of these ideas that kind of are used as part of the thread throughout.
Yeah, that's so lucky, I think, and in a sense, like you were saying, the stars aligned with, I know many poets who've had books published and they have no control over the cover, and it may or may not match. And I know we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but like you said, in this case in particular, it's such a resonant image with the contents of the book. It would not feel like the same collection without that as its cover. So it's nice that all aligned, and the
Yeah,
on board with that.
and I sent them the three variations: the colored version, the black and white, and the sepia. And they went with the sepia as well because they said that was the strongest, feeling for the overall content of the book.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too because as you're talking about, versions with color or black and white, and the sepia is like a middle ground between all the color that we get in the poems, the painterliness and the vibrancy of the colors that come through those poems, and also this, maybe a more ghost-like world where things are, black or white, or sort of not in color, not in the realm of that vibrancy. So in a sense, that sepia is a little bit of a bridge there in my mind.
It made me think a lot about like Anselm, the photographer. Uh, I just had his name in the back of my mind, but he's Anselm something. A lot of his depictions of Native American, his photography, show a lot of the sepia of the Southwestern indigenous people, um, which I thought this kind of hints at that a little bit. Not that I got any inspiration from that, but it made me think about some of the historical ways that a lot of indigenous people were depicted at
Yeah.
that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course there are some, I don't know if this is true in the cultures that you come from, but some indigenous communities feel that to take one's picture is to take one's spirit. And so the choice of you know, um, the covering feels like a sort of, you know, push back against, no, you can't have my face. So I don't know if that was in your mind, but it occurred to me a little bit as you were talking about.
Yeah, there's this small, minute hint at this idea of erasure because I know that Akutagawa, a lot of his work was focused on this concept of erasure because he struggled with mental illness. I mean, he worked at the universities, he taught writing, he was a writer, a publisher. But he just never felt like he was confident in anything that he had done. He felt like he failed as a son, he failed as a husband, he failed as a writer. So all of these things that he was grappling with in his life, he just thought he was, this failure. And the fact that he felt like he was slowly losing himself through mental illness, he felt like he was just kind of going into this void. And if you read the manuscript of his A Fool's Life, he sort of talks about that a little bit in the note that he left for his publisher. I mean, it's really interesting. Like, I mean, I think that when you read something like that, it is sort of the last will and testament of somebody, and that's the only thing that you have left of what somebody is thinking. It does make you think about how that person saw themselves in life, and that's really their final conclusion, because you can't he can't really go back and say, well, this is I forget that, this is what I really meant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I feel like we could probably spend another 3 hours talking about all the wonderful poetic strengths of this book. And I just want to encourage everyone who's either reading or listening to this interview to go buy the book and really experience what we're talking about here. Would you mind to close us out to possibly read something from the later part of the book, Unfolding?
Okay, sure, yeah, I'll do that. This one is called Unfolding. Quote, when my breast grew cold, everything was as silent as the dead in their graves. What profound silence, unquote. R. Akutagawa, In the Grove, the story of the murdered man as told through a medium. Part 1. Love is trite and needs reinvention. Touch only happens if we writhe in pain. Sex sells itself and is only empty banging and defines every aspect of our actual existence. Rape exists because we don't look out for each other, as offense is the new courtesy. Section 2. Women and creation are still sacred. Men and junk are a pointless concept. Gender is expressed within us all, which includes those not included. Gays, homosexuals, and faggots need a new revolution. Lesbians and dykes need to lead this uprising. HIV and AIDS are not a social disease, nor a memory lost on many, only a calamity for those who unknowingly become infected. This is the only crisis. Section 3. Diagnosis is a scam, and prescriptions silence the masses into lacking choice. Medication prolongs the inevitable and nulls the contents inside our skulls. Drugs are out of fashion because of prescriptions. Alcohol should be given away hourly because it is ineffective prescriptions against choice. Section 4. Birth leaves us all vulnerable. Without adults, we would wither. Childhood remembers sexuality and sometimes the abuse, but often forgets laughter. Adulthood is built on seduction and preys on the availability of the susceptible ones. Old age is locked away in an infinite convalescence, and neglected to die, rot, and decay, which is easier suits to wear. Home is where a family congregates, but is often lost in financial institution. A shelter is for those who cannot attain a home. Homeless is a result of senseless invasions, genocide, and displacement. Section 6. Peace does not exist. War is based on legal fiction. A purpose is undefined because we still wander the earth senselessly. Section 8. Our blood color does not discriminate. Race is categorized to settle apathy. Ethnicity creates segregation for regulation inside an edifice of boxes. Loss of identity is loss of soul and self, but not defined as a disaster. Names are kept warding off educated imbeciles. Section 9. Belief is the possibility where many can exist. Religion is the other scam. Spirituality can determine a course onto the interior and exterior cosmos. Artifact remains unearthed to remind us of our existence. Section 10. I am still solving for X. Like I said, that last line is sort of a hint to my first book, Genesis Redacted. In that book, I play with the idea of intersections as identity, and X is really the thing that pulls everything in that collection together. So I'm kind of making reference to that, but here it's more personalized.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's an interesting poem in the collection because it's a little bit different in the form, and it breaks a lot of rules that we are told in poetry craft, just to show everything through image, right? So in this collection where you have provided, just a richness of image, and we talked about the color and so forth, to have a poem to round out the collection, which has a different voice. I think it's an interesting choice for poets to think about, that all poems don't have to follow the same rules in a book, and that sometimes a different mode, even at the end, can provide just a not a final perspective, but open another doorway, out into whether that's your next book or something that they need to think about, or we need to, explore on our own as readers.
Right. And the poem also makes connections to the very first poem, and this idea that I talk about, this idea of, the 50 years that I've lived on this earth and what I've thought about. Everything is everything deserving? Is everything meant to be? Or, are we just sort of running around, with no purpose, really? And we're trying to make purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Because I always think that everything is undetermined. I mean, so that makes it think that I don't believe in destiny, because if we did, I mean, we would know exactly where we're supposed to be or what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to end up. And for me and what I believe, that's just not the way it is. Because if it was, then we'd always be surrounded by our friends, our family, our loved ones. But they go on, and some of us are meant to stay behind and continue.
Yeah. Well, Crisosto, such an incredible book. What a wonderful conversation. So many wonderful things for poets to think about in their own work, to reflect on, as I hope they will go and read the book. How can folks find more information about your writing, your other books, and so forth?
They can find it mostly on my website. I try to keep it all updated. But they can go to my publisher, Gnashing Teeth, which holds my book. And there are articles that I've been included in. I usually post that on social media. I'm on Instagram, Crisosto_Apache. I think if you Google my name, all of this stuff will probably come up. But yeah, there's a couple of textbooks where they've asked me to do like interviews or on the process of my writing. I know one of them had just come out, which is the Handbook of Contemporary American Poetry, put out by oh geez, it's on my social media. I forget the textbook. That's what it's called, or the publisher of it. I forget.
I'll
But
put
yes, a lot of that can be found online.
yeah. Yeah, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Crisosto. Such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And I hope we'll be able to do it again soon when you get your next book published.
Look forward to it.